The success of our students is a goal of education. Holding teachers, school district leaders, as well as schools accountable for student success or failure is a hot issue being debated across the state and across the country. Rick Hess, a great friend and a national expert on the issue of education reform. I had a chance to sit down with Rick recently and get his feelings on holding teachers accountable for student success. Well, Rick, I mean, you obviously, when we look at education reform across this country, no name is more prominent than Rick Hess. And you've done great work in terms of your writing and you're in challenging the status quo in public education. Tell us a little bit about, why you've taken on this challenge.
For me, almost all of the work I think I do in education, when we talk about how do we use teachers and pay teachers, how do we think about accountability, how do we think about how we organize schools and forge great cultures, just about all goes back to my own time and my student teaching, my teaching, when I mentored teachers as a supervisor. Day after day I was struck that we had people who wanted to do the right thing, people who cared about kids, and we were operating in systems that just didn't make any darn sense. We weren't rewarding people for doing a great job. When you had people who wanted to lift more and make more of a difference, we were making it hard on them. And when you had somebody who was mediocre or doing a lousy job down the hallway in central administration, we just kind of treated that as par for the course. And so much of my work just comes from the notion that this is important, fascinating, enjoyable work. And I can't for the life of me imagine why we want to drown it in bureaucratic silliness.
But now it gets into the accountability issue. And how do you see it? I mean, obviously, the education has taken on a prominent role at the national level. We're hearing a lot of things around school reform and transformation. And now in Indiana, we're seeing what we believe will be unprecedented change in public policy with respect to education. How do you see all these policies aligning to get the kind of change that you're advocating?
I think sometimes we get caught up in the mechanics and we forget the first principle. The reason that we should embrace accountability in education is two reasons. One, we're spending public dollars. People who don't have children in schools, people who may not set foot in a school in a given decade, are paying for that education. And they deserve to know that their money is being spent sensibly. And second, we run schools for the benefit of the kids. And the only way at the end of the day that we can check ourselves and make sure what we think is working for kids is the right thing to do is to make sure that we're holding ourselves accountable. Now, this doesn't mean that accountability should just be about reading and math scores. Reading and math scores are tools of accountability. Accountability has got to be about respecting those two responsibilities. And what happens, I think, is sometimes because accountability is such an unusual idea in education that we wind up putting the testing cart ahead of the accountability horse.
And why do you think that is?
Because I think we turn these things into holy wars. Accountability shouldn't be a radical notion. I want my police in my community to be accountable. I want firemen. I want highway builders to be accountable. I want everybody who does public work to be accountable for spending our money smart and for doing their work well. The fact that accountability in education has become a hot button issue, I think partly suggests that we've talked about it in a way that loses this kind of central insight. But B, it's also the case that you absolutely have apologists in education who somehow suggested that asking schools to be accountable or asking teachers to be accountable represents an attack on teachers and schooling. And that just strikes me as the furthest thing from the truth. It's hard for me to imagine how educators with a straight face can say, send us your kids, mail us your money, but then stay out and don't ask how well we're doing. That just seems like a strange proposition.
One of your books, Comments on School Reform, you take on some major issues. And that's really been your career and your writing and so forth. A few moments ago you talked about compensation and the idea, and what we're seeing at the state level and state level policy that's advocated in this current General Assembly is the idea of rewarding great teachers and great principals. How do you propose and how do you see those as levers of change?
Right now, the way education compensation works is it's pretty much driven by how long a teacher has taught and how many credit hours they've accumulated. Well, this is ludicrous because we know that neither of these is a particularly good predictor of how good a teacher is. It strikes me that in education, like anywhere else, we ought to embrace the radical idea that people who are good at their jobs ought to get paid more than people who are bad at their jobs. Now, in education, somehow this seems novel, and that's just peculiar. But in most walks of life, if you're really good at your job, you don't just get a little more money because you were good last year. You get promoted. You get asked to take on new responsibilities. You get asked to take on new responsibilities because it lets you do more good. So the notion that we're going to take our best teachers, give them 24 kids this year, they're going to knock it out of the park, we're going to give them another $4,000 or $5,000, and they're going to do another 24 kids next year is crazy. If you look at a school and you see a great reading teacher in a 4th grade and a lousy 4th grade reading teacher in that same school, I don't want them each teaching 24 kids for 90 minutes. I want that great reading teacher teaching everybody. And if that's the case, they should get a lot more money. Not because their test scores are higher, but because they're more valuable. Not because they're better people, but because they're making a bigger difference in kids' lives. So what we need is to look at these merit pay plans as a first step to get us used to the idea, but we need to say we're spending $600 billion on K-12 education. 55% of that is going into classroom teacher salaries. How do we spend that $330 billion in a way that gets the best teachers and gets them to take on the opportunities that they need to fill?
Rick, I admire your courage and your willingness to step out on behalf of America's children, and we appreciate you taking time with us today.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here with you.
Yeah, thank you. The EVSC is implementing accountability measures across the school district and in several schools ahead of state and federal mandates. We're going to learn more about those schools after this.